June 10th, 1912, Villisca, Iowa. The sun has already climbed over the flat fields, but the Moore house remains still. Too still. No smoke from the chimney, no children's laughter echoing down the road. Next door, Mary Peckham noticed something strange. Josiah and Sarah Moore were early risers, always. By this hour, she should have heard the clatter of breakfast dishes, or seen Sarah hanging laundry on the line. The yard is quiet. The chickens still peck at empty ground, unfed. Mary steps closer. Curtains are drawn tight, the front door locked. She knocks, waits. Nothing. An uneasy feeling curls in her stomach. Something's wrong. Mary calls for help. Josiah's brother Ross Moore arrives with a spare key and steps inside the house. The air is heavy, stale, metallic, silent. The first thing he notices is how dark it is. Every curtain pulled, every mirror covered, lamps without chimneys. Ross moves through the narrow hallway toward the downstairs bedroom. What he finds there freezes him in place. Two small shapes lie in the bed, the Stillinger sisters, guests of the Moore children. Their faces are covered with bedsheets. Dark stains seep through the fabric. Ross stumbles back, his voice shaking. Something terrible's happened. He rushes upstairs, and there, in every room, it's the same. The Moore family, Josiah, Sarah, and their 4 children, all dead. Bludgeoned beyond recognition. The axe still inside the house. Every clock has stopped, hands frozen around midnight. Outside, word spreads fast. Within minutes, neighbors gather on the lawn, whispering, crying, demanding to know what happened. But no one has an answer. No one heard a scream. No one saw a stranger. No one knows why someone would butcher an entire family, 6 children and 2 adults in their sleep. In 1912, Villisca, Iowa, was the kind of town people dream about. A few hundred homes lined with white fences and wide porches. The population is slightly more than 2,000 people. The kind of place where you left your door unlocked, your horse untied, and your neighbors knew not just your name, but the smell and taste of your Sunday pie. And at the center of it all was the Moore family, the very picture of small-town respectability. Josiah Moore, or Joe, as everyone called him, was a successful businessman. He owned the local implement store, selling farm tools and equipment. Reliable, friendly, and known for his work ethic, he was one of those men people trusted. His wife, Sarah, was equally admired, active in the church, gentle with children, a warm smile for everyone who passed by. Together they had 4 kids, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, ages 5 to 11. Bright, well-behaved, full of the kind of innocence that made people proud to call Villisca home. They weren't rich, but they were happy, and in a small town, that was better than wealth. That Sunday, June 9th, had been a special day. The Presbyterian Church was holding its annual Children's Day service, a community celebration filled with music, laughter, and pride. Sarah helped organize it. The Moore kids all performed. Josiah sat in the pews, beaming. After the service ended around 9:30 p.m., the family lingered outside, chatting with friends. The children begged their parents to let Lena and Ina Stillinger, 2 sisters from out of town, spend the night. The girls' parents agreed. It was just one night, and they trusted the Moores completely. So 8 happy souls, 6 Moores and 2 Stillinger sisters, walked home under the warm June moonlight. Neighbors remembered hearing their laughter fade down the street. It would be the last time anyone ever heard their voices. By morning, Villisca's peace was gone, replaced by a fear so deep it would divide the town for decades. When the bodies were discovered, it wasn't just a crime scene. It was a betrayal. In a world where doors were never locked, now everyone bolted theirs. Men started sleeping with shotguns beside their beds. Children were kept indoors after dark. Strangers were no longer greeted. They were watched. The church bells that once called people to worship now tolled for 8 lives lost. And for the first time, Villisca, that quiet farming town, felt the heavy presence of evil. Rumors spread fast. Some whispered about a jealous rival of Josiah's, others about a drifter or a madman with a grudge. But there was no clear suspect, no motive, and no sign of forced entry. Whoever did this had walked right into that house, and as investigators would soon discover, this killer had taken their time. Because every clock stopped at midnight, every mirror was covered, and every body was arranged with eerie care, as if someone wanted to erase their faces and their humanity. A small town's community built on trust now trembled in the shadow of something it could never explain. The Moores had been the perfect family, and that made their deaths the perfect nightmare. Villisca, Iowa, June 10, 1912. A town that had never seen a serious crime was about to face one of the darkest in American history. When Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, forced open the door to his brother's home, he expected to find laughter, or maybe just late sleepers. Instead, he stumbled back in horror. A shape under the bedsheets, the smell of iron. The silence was so deep it roared in his ears. He ran outside, pale and shaking, and called for help. Within minutes, Hank Horton, Villisca's town marshal, arrived. Horton wasn't used to scenes like this. His job usually involved wandering livestock, neighbor disputes, or maybe a drunken argument after Sunday service. Law enforcement in small-town Iowa back then wasn't like today. There were no crime labs, no fingerprint databases, no forensics teams. Most police were part-time, self-trained, and unequipped for anything beyond petty theft. Evidence collection? It was guesswork, often done with bare hands or not at all. In 1912, detectives relied on instinct, hearsay, and luck. They didn't have the training to handle a massacre, certainly not this one. So when Hank Horton stepped inside the Moore home, he didn't know that every footprint, every fingerprint, every piece of evidence he touched was about to be lost forever. The first thing he noticed was how dark the house felt. Every curtain was drawn tight, even though the morning sun was already high. The air was heavy and still. Then, the smell hit him. A mix of blood and something metallic, sweet and foul at once. He lit a kerosene lamp, its flickering light revealing something that made him stop breathing. On the bed in the front bedroom lay two Stillinger girls, Lena and Ina. Their faces covered with sheets, blood soaking through the fabric. A dark pool spreading beneath them. Horton backed into the hallway, and then saw more. Room after room, bed after bed, 8 bodies, all bludgeoned, all covered. The walls spattered with blood. A stillness so complete, it almost seemed reverent. When investigators arrived from neighboring towns, they began piecing together what little they could. The killer had started upstairs, in the master bedroom, where Josiah and Sarah Moore slept. Josiah received the worst of it, his face shattered beyond recognition, his eyes destroyed. The ceiling above him bore a deep gouge where the killer had swung the axe so high it hit the plaster. Sarah lay beside him, her face bloodied but less mutilated. The killer had used the sharp edge of the axe on her, but the blunt end on everyone else. Down the hall, the 4 Moore children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, were found in their beds, each struck repeatedly in the head. They never woke up. After killing the children, the murderer returned to the master bedroom and struck Josiah and Sarah again. One blow so violent it knocked over Josiah's shoe, which had quietly filled with his own blood. Then, the killer moved downstairs, into the guest room. There, he bludgeoned Ina and Lena Stillinger, the visiting girls, likely the last to die. The younger, Ina, was found lying peacefully. All of the victims except for Lena Stillinger had been asleep when murdered. Lena's body told a different story. She was positioned crosswise on the bed, as if she'd awakened, seen the killer, and tried to flee. Her arm bore a defensive wound. Her nightgown was lifted, her undergarments removed, and her body posed grotesquely. Investigators immediately assumed she'd been sexually assaulted, but later tests, what little could be done in 1912, suggested she had not been. Whatever happened in that room was psychological, not sexual. It was about power and ritual. Then came the strangest details, the ones that haunted even seasoned officers. Every mirror in the house was covered, as if the killer didn't want to be seen. Every face was draped with sheets, a gesture that felt almost tender, as if the murderer couldn't bear to look at what they'd done. A lamp chimney had been removed, its wick bent, possibly to dim the light, creating only a faint glow as the killer moved room to room. In the kitchen, food was laid out on the table but untouched, like someone had planned a meal after the murders then changed their mind. A bowl of bloody water sat nearby. The killer had washed hands, calmly, methodically. Beside it, police found something that still baffles historians. A 4-pound slab of bacon, removed from the icebox and left against the wall, next to the axe. Why? No one knows. The axe itself was Josiah Moore's own, wiped clean and left leaning near the Stillinger girl's bed. And finally, a fragment of a keychain, found on the floor. It didn't belong to anyone in the Moore family. It was the only real clue left behind. But the horror inside the Moore home didn't end with the discovery. It only got worse. After the first officers finished their walkthrough, the unthinkable happened. They let townspeople inside. It began as curiosity, a few neighbors stepping through the door to see for themselves. But at 8:40 a.m., Villisca's central telephone operator sent an all-call to every household, alerting the entire town that the Moores had been murdered. Within minutes, dozens, then hundreds of people poured into the little white house. Who knows? Maybe the real killer was among them. By the time law enforcement realized what was happening, it was too late. Every inch of the scene was trampled. Fingerprints, footprints, fibers, gone. Even worse, some locals began taking souvenirs. Someone even pocketed a piece of Josiah Moore's skull. The murder weapon, the axe, was passed around, handled by dozens, maybe hundreds of hands. When the sheriff finally tried to clear the crowd, the evidence was already irreversibly destroyed. At 9 a.m., Dr. Lindquist, the county coroner, arrived. He was appalled. The home was overrun, the investigation already compromised beyond repair. He urged Sheriff Orrin Jackson to call in the National Guard to restore order. It wasn't until 10:30 a.m. that soldiers finally secured the perimeter and began turning people away. By then, the crime scene was a circus. Dr. Lindquist convened the coroner's jury that afternoon, but bureaucracy and confusion dragged on for hours. It wasn't until after 10 p.m. that the bodies were finally cleared for removal. They were taken to the fire station, repurposed as a makeshift morgue. It was nearly 2 a.m., almost 24 hours after the murders, before all 8 victims were laid out for examination. By then, the warm June air had already begun the process of decomposition. The delay, the contamination, and the mishandling of evidence guaranteed one thing. The Villisca Axe Murders would remain unsolved forever. And still more came. Doctors, undertakers, local officials, each with their own theory. Some thought it was a mad drifter who hopped a train and vanished. Others whispered about revenge or a dark ritual. One theory suggested the killer waited in the attic, hidden in the shadows, watching the family come home from church. 2 spent cigarette butts found up there supported that. The killer had waited, listening as the family laughed, prayed, and went to sleep, before descending into darkness. To investigators, it was unlike anything they'd ever seen. There was no robbery, no valuables taken. The doors were locked when Ross Moore arrived. And despite the savagery, there was a disturbing sense of order, of control. The blows weren't wild or rushed. They were deliberate, measured, almost ceremonial. Whoever did this wasn't acting out of sudden rage. They took their time. The local coroner, Dr. Lindquist, summed it up in his report. This was the work of a calculating hand. Not an act of passion, but of purpose. And that's what terrified Villisca most. Because this wasn't a random tragedy. This was intentional. A house of faith and family had become a temple of death. every small, strange detail suggesting something more than just murder. The covered mirrors, the meal laid out but untouched, the ritual arrangement of the bodies, each choice whispering one haunting truth. Whoever entered that home didn't come to kill in anger. They came to perform something, to finish something. The town marshal's report ended with a single line: too many questions, and no one left alive to answer them. The Villisca Axe Murders would become one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in American history, a case that not only shattered a family, but destroyed the illusion of safety in every small town across the Midwest. Because if it could happen here, to the Moores, in their quiet, tidy home, it could happen anywhere to anyone. But tragedy struck not only the Moore family. News of the Stillinger girls' deaths struck their family like lightning out of a clear sky. Joe and Sarah Stillinger were simple, hard-working farm folks, devoted to their two daughters, Lena and Ina, their only children. The sisters had spent the night at the Moore house for what was meant to be a cheerful Sunday visit, a harmless sleepover between friends. When word reached the Stillinger farm that the girls had not returned home, Joe rode into town, unaware of the nightmare that awaited him. Witnesses later said he stood motionless as the truth was told. Both daughters gone, taken in an act of senseless brutality. In the days that followed, the Stillinger home fell silent. The farm chores went undone, curtains stayed drawn, and neighbors brought food no one touched. The grief never left that family, nor the town that mourned with them. The morning after the murders, Villisca ceased to be a quiet dot on the Iowa map. By sunrise, the town's name was on every telegraph wire between Des Moines and Chicago. By noon, it was on the front pages of newspapers across the Midwest, and by the end of the week, it was national news. The Villisca Axe Murders screamed the headlines. For a farming town of about 2,000 people, this was unimaginable. Villisca had never seen anything like it, nor would it ever again. By mid-morning Monday, reporters began to arrive, first from neighboring towns, then from Omaha, then Des Moines. They carried notebooks, bulky cameras, and the hunger for a story that would sell papers. And Villisca gave them one: blood, mystery, and fear. Within 24 hours, the quiet Main Street became a chaos of carriages and automobiles. Newsmen crowded the sidewalks, photographers posed next to the Moore house, and gossip spread faster than anyone could print it. Some journalists wrote about a crazed drifter or a bloodthirsty maniac. Others claimed it was the work of a cult. There were even whispers of ritual killings, a phrase that ensured every newspaper edition sold out before dusk. The press turned Villisca's tragedy into America's first modern media frenzy. And as headlines multiplied, so did the fear. For generations, Villisca had been built on trust. Doors were left unlocked, horses untied, kids roamed freely after dark. But after June 10, 1912, that trust rotted overnight. Everyone looked at everyone else differently. Men who once chatted on porches now crossed the street when they saw one another. Women whispered behind curtains. Children were told not to speak to anyone, even to friends. The Moores had been beloved, church-going, successful, friendly. If they could be butchered in their beds, who was safe? Soon, the townsfolk began suspecting their own. Someone said the killer must have known the layout of the Moore home. Another swore they'd seen a shadow near the railroad tracks. A farmer claimed he saw strange footprints near his barn. And before long, nearly every man in Villisca, the minister, the blacksmith, even Josiah Moore's own brother, had been quietly accused by someone. Fear made the town unrecognizable. Theories began to sprout like weeds. Some pointed to a traveling preacher who had left town just days before the murders. Others blamed a wandering farmhand who'd been seen near the depot. One popular theory claimed it was the work of a jealous rival in Josiah Moore's business, a man consumed by resentment. And then, the most chilling theory of all, that this wasn't the first time. Reporters began connecting dots between unsolved axe murders across the Midwest, in Kansas, Illinois, and Colorado. Entire families slaughtered in their homes, always near train tracks, always at night. The idea took hold that a serial killer, the Axeman of the Midwest, was riding the rails from town to town, striking without warning, vanishing before sunrise. The pattern was too perfect, too haunting. And though no one could prove it, the theory gave shape to the fear. A faceless predator, always moving, always watching. By the second week, Villisca was overrun. Hotels filled with reporters and curiosity seekers. Vendors set up stands selling postcards of the Moore house. People arrived by train just to see the murder house. It became a grotesque attraction. Some even brought their children to point at the windows where the victims had once slept. Photographs of the Moore family, once cherished keepsakes, now appeared in papers beside grisly headlines. The line between tragedy and entertainment blurred completely, and the town, already wounded, began to break under the weight of its own infamy. The Villisca Axe Murders didn't just end 8 lives. They ended an era. Small-town America had long believed itself immune to big city evil. Violence was something that happened elsewhere. In Chicago, in St. Louis, in the papers. Not here, not in Villisca. But now, the myth of safety was gone. Families started locking their doors. Men kept shotguns by their beds, and the glow of oil lamps burned late into the night. For months afterward, Villisca's streets emptied by dusk. The local church, once filled with laughter and song, became a refuge for frightened souls. People prayed not only for the Moors, but for deliverance from their own fear. America, too, was changing. The Villisca case marked the beginning of something new, a national fascination with murder, mystery, and the macabre. It was one of the first times the public devoured every gruesome detail of a multiple homicide, one of the first times crime reporting blurred into spectacle. In a way, Villisca became the birthplace of the true crime obsession, and its victims, the first unwilling protagonists in a story that would never truly end. The town of Villisca was drowning in whispers. As the summer sun rose over the little Iowa fields, rumors spread like smoke, curling through streets, church pews, and schoolyards. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had a name in mind. But the truth, if it ever existed at all, remained hidden behind the blood-soaked walls of the Moore house. The investigation unfolded like a fever dream, clumsy, frantic, and tainted by human error. But among the chaos, 4 men emerged from the fog, each one with a shadow dark enough to make people wonder. Could this be the killer? In a town as small as Villisca, grudges had long memories. Frank Jones was no stranger to either success or resentment. He was one of the most prominent men in town, a wealthy businessman, owner of the local hardware store, and a respected state senator. His reputation gleamed like polished brass, but beneath the shine, something sour was said to simmer. Years earlier, Josiah Moore had worked for Frank Jones, running the hardware department with sharp skill and ambition. But Josiah wasn't content being someone else's man. When he left Jones's store to open his own business, including a very successful John Deere dealership, he didn't just take experience with him. He took customers, too. Many believe Jones never forgave him for it. And then came the other rumor, the one whispered behind lace curtains and under the hum of Sunday service. It was said that Josiah Moore had been intimate with Frank Jones's daughter-in-law, Donna, a scandalous affair that might have burned Jones's pride deeper than any business rivalry could. Although there is no official evidence of this. When the murders struck, Jones's name was one of the first to pass between trembling lips. Revenge, jealousy, humiliation, all tidy motives. He had motive, power, money, and influence enough to make such an act possible, perhaps even to hide it. Frank Jones was never officially charged or tried for the Moore family murders. However, he was very much a central figure of suspicion, both publicly and within parts of the investigation. Investigators later speculated that Jones might not have wielded the axe himself, but instead hired someone to do it. The name that surfaced next gave this theory teeth: a man whose shadow stretched beyond Villisca's borders. William "Insane" Blackie Mansfield was not a man of roots. He drifted from town to town, leaving behind a trail of rumors, rage, and sometimes bodies. A laborer by trade, he had the rough hands and restless eyes of someone who had seen too much and cared too little. Mansfield's name first came up when investigators began comparing the Villisca murders to a string of eerily similar crimes in other Midwestern towns. Whole families slaughtered in their sleep, curtains drawn, doors locked from the inside, lamps extinguished, an axe left behind. In 1911, a family in Illinois met their end in nearly identical fashion. 2 years later, another in Kansas. Each scene bore the same haunting pattern: a murderer methodical enough to cover mirrors, deliberate enough to clean the blade, and cold enough to vanish before dawn. Detective James Wilkerson of the Burns Detective Agency became convinced that Mansfield was the man behind all of it. He pointed to Mansfield's own past: a cocaine-addicted serial killer who brutally murdered his wife, her parents, and his infant child in 1912. All hacked to death with an axe. Mansfield had fled, and though he was later arrested, he produced an alibi that set him free. Wilkerson insisted the Villisca killings fit the same pattern: same weapon, same staging, same darkness. He swore Mansfield had taken a train to Villisca on the night of June 9, 1912, then left before sunrise. But the evidence was thin, and Mansfield's alibi, work records, and witness statements held up in court. The jury didn't buy it. Mansfield walked free. He was released for a lack of evidence, and later won a lawsuit he brought against Wilkerson, and was awarded $2,225. Yet, for years after, townsfolk couldn't shake the thought that a drifter with dead eyes had passed through Villisca one warm June night and left 8 souls behind. Of all the suspects, none captured the public's imagination or fear like Reverend George Kelly. He arrived in Villisca the day before the murders to attend the Children's Day service at the Moore's Presbyterian Church, where the Moore children performed. A small man with piercing eyes and nervous hands, Kelly was known to be eccentric. His sermons, witnesses said, sometimes spiraled into strange, feverish territory. He was a traveling preacher, but his reputation followed him from town to town, a reputation for erratic behavior and dark fixations. On the morning after the murders, Kelly boarded a train out of Villisca. According to other passengers, he talked incessantly about the killings, before the news had even been made public. When asked how he could possibly know, Kelly reportedly smiled and changed the subject. That small, unsettling detail lodged in investigators' minds. Over the following years, Kelly's name came up again and again. He wrote letters to the police, to the victims' families, even to himself, confessing, then retracting, then confessing once more. His words were strange, frantic, full of contradictions. In 1917, 5 years after the murders, Kelly was arrested and charged with the crime. His confession was vivid, describing how he slipped into the Moore home under God's command, waited in the darkness, and did what was required. But when the trial began, the confession unraveled. Kelly's lawyers argued that he was mentally ill, a delusional man who had been coerced into admitting something he didn't do. The jury agreed. After 2 trials, he was acquitted. Still, even after his release, Villisca never looked at him the same. The idea of a preacher, a supposed man of faith, standing over sleeping children with an axe was too horrifying to forget. For many, Kelly's acquittal didn't clear him. It only made him a ghost that haunted the story forever. Another potential suspect, Andy Sawyer, was a railroad worker, one of many who followed the tracks across Iowa in those days. He was described as jittery, intense, always watching the shadows. Days after the murders, Sawyer was picked up by a railroad crew boss who thought something about him seemed off. He was covered in soot, carrying an axe, and couldn't stop talking about the killings in Villisca. He claimed to know intimate details: how the bodies were found, how the killer moved in the night, how quiet it must have been inside that house. When the crew slept, Sawyer reportedly sat awake, staring into the dark, clutching his axe like a lifeline. The crew grew frightened. They turned him over to the authorities, but Sawyer had an alibi. He'd been working with the railroad crew in another town on the night of the murders, miles away. The timeline cleared him. The police released him soon after. Still, his name lingered in the public imagination. There was something about him, the nervous obsession, the wandering eyes, that seemed to fit the picture of the faceless killer. Even if the facts said otherwise, fear rarely listens to reason. By the time the investigations ended, Villisca had 4 men, 4 possible answers, and no justice. Each one had a motive, a shadow, a whisper of guilt. Yet every one of them slipped through the cracks. Frank Jones, the proud businessman with a secret grudge, died with his innocence or guilt unproven. William Mansfield vanished into the back roads of America, his name tied to a dozen deaths but never convicted of any. Reverend Kelly lived out his years in obscurity, writing erratic letters about God, guilt, and redemption. Andy Sawyer faded into the landscape of forgotten drifters, his strange obsession remembered only in the footnotes of the case. The Villisca investigation didn't end with the familiar 4 names. Over time, other figures emerged: drifters, killers, men whose paths crossed the Midwest like ghosts in the night. None were ever proven guilty, but each carried enough darkness to make investigators wonder. Henry Lee Moore, a name that chilled even seasoned detectives. No relation to the Villisca family, though fate made the connection grimly ironic. In 1912, the same year as the Villisca murders, Moore was convicted of killing his own mother and grandmother with an axe in Missouri. Investigators soon noticed unsettling similarities. Entire families murdered as they slept, the weapon left at the scene, and a calm, deliberate brutality that seemed more ritual than rage. Some theorized Henry Lee was a wandering psychopath, striking across state lines, but no solid link to Villisca was ever found. Then there was Samuel Ronald Moyer, brother to Sarah Moore. The two had reportedly quarreled over family matters before the killings. Some townspeople whispered that Moyer's anger had curdled into something murderous. Yet investigators never uncovered any proof. Just grief, suspicion, and the tragedy of bloodlines tangled in rumor. And beyond them all, in the darker corners of theory, lurked the figure of Paul Mueller, a name unearthed decades later by modern researchers. Mueller was a German immigrant and suspected serial killer connected to a series of eerily similar axe murders stretching from Massachusetts to Kansas between 1898 and 1912. The victims, entire families, slain in their homes at night. The method, nearly identical to Villisca. Trains connected many of the towns, and Villisca itself sat on a major railway line. Some believe Mueller may have been the faceless traveler, a phantom crossing America's rails, leaving only silence behind. There were others, too. Nameless transients, jealous lovers, vagrants seen near the Moore home that summer. Each new lead seemed promising for a day, then dissolved like morning mist. The deeper investigators dug, the more the truth seemed to blur, as if the killer were not a man at all, but a shadow that slipped between faces and names, using them, discarding them, until no one could say for sure who had really stood in that quiet house on the night of June 9th, 1912. No single story fit, no evidence ever held. The truth dissolved in rumor, time, and fear. And yet, the people of Villisca couldn't move on. Each Sunday, the church bells rang for a town still in mourning. The Moore house, that quiet white home on the corner, became something more than wood and nails. It was a wound that never healed, a monument to the unanswered question: who swung the axe? As decades passed, the names of the suspects turned into myths, cautionary figures whispered about by locals and ghost hunters alike. But one by one, those who had once pointed fingers or sworn they knew the truth faded away. Only the silence of that house remained, standing against time like a question no one could bear to answer. The murders had left Villisca frozen in fear, but as the years passed, that fear turned to something else: suspicion, frustration, the desperate need for answers. Everyone in town had a theory, but what they lacked was evidence. The case became a dark obsession, and eventually, one name began to echo louder than the rest: Reverend George Kelly. He wasn't the most obvious suspect, not at first, but as investigators dug deeper, the eccentric preacher's strange behavior seemed to pull him into the spotlight. Kelly had left Villisca the morning after the murders, boarding an early train out of town. Passengers recalled how he seemed nervous, jittery, and how he spoke about the killings before the crime had been made public. It was an unnerving detail, one that lingered for years in the minds of detectives. By 1917, 5 long years after the crime, the trail had gone cold. Then a letter arrived. It was from Kelly himself, written to investigators, filled with cryptic references to the murders. He spoke of divine visions, of God's command, of cleansing sins with blood. In some letters, he denied involvement. In others, he seemed to confess. Eventually, police brought him in for questioning. What followed was one of the strangest interrogations in American criminal history. Under pressure, Kelly confessed. He said God had spoken to him that night in Villisca, commanding him to slay the children of sin. He described entering the Moore home under divine instruction, standing over the sleeping family, and raising the axe again and again until silence filled the rooms. He claimed he had been driven by a holy voice he could not resist. But just as quickly as the confession came, it unraveled. Within hours, Kelly began to change his story. He recanted, then retracted his recantation. He claimed the police had tricked him. Then he said his words had been misinterpreted. It was chaos, and the press devoured every word. Reverend Kelly's first trial in 1917 was a media circus. Newspapers called it the Axe Trial of the Century. Journalists flooded the small courthouse in Red Oak, Iowa, describing every twitch, every murmur, every time the Reverend bowed his head in prayer. But behind the sensational headlines, the case itself was weak. There was no physical evidence tying Kelly to the scene. The axe had never been definitively linked to him. No fingerprints, no bloodstains, not a single eyewitness. Even the confession, the heart of the prosecution's case, was suspect. Interrogations in the early 1900s were brutal and often manipulative. Kelly was mentally unstable, easily coerced, and desperate for attention. Some said he would confess to anything if it meant people would finally listen. The jury deliberated for days, and when they returned, they were deadlocked. A mistrial was declared. The state tried again months later, determined to convict someone, anyone, for the horror that had stained Villisca's name. But the second trial went no better. The defense painted Kelly as a delusional man, not a murderer. They brought witnesses who described his erratic, childlike behavior, his habit of following women through towns, of writing strange letters, of preaching about sin and redemption in empty rooms. The jury saw not a killer, but a broken soul. After hours of deliberation, they returned their verdict: not guilty. Reverend George Kelly was acquitted. The acquittal should have brought closure, but instead, it deepened the wound. Villisca had waited 5 years for justice, and all it received was confusion. In truth, the case had been doomed from the very beginning. The crime scene had been a disaster. Within hours of the murders being discovered, hundreds of townspeople had poured into the Moore house, out of morbid curiosity, disbelief, or sheer panic. They walked through the rooms, touched the bodies, even took souvenirs. One man reportedly lifted a fragment of Josiah Moore's skull as proof he had been there. There were no standardized forensic methods at the time, no DNA testing, no fingerprint databases. Even the simplest forms of crime scene preservation were ignored. By the time investigators arrived, any clues the killer might have left had been trampled or carried away. So the police turned to what they had: rumor, intuition, and confession. It was a dangerous combination, one that ruined reputations and produced no answers. After Kelly's acquittal, Villisca changed. The town that once gathered at church picnics and parades now avoided each other in the streets. Neighbors turned inward. Families locked their doors for the first time. Some still believed Frank Jones was behind it, that money and politics had silenced the truth. Others swore Reverend Kelly was guilty, that his madness had carried him beyond reason. And many believed the real killer was a stranger, a traveler who stepped off a train one night and disappeared forever. Decades passed. The house remained, standing quietly at the edge of town, its windows empty, its story whispered in classrooms and along dusty roads. New generations grew up hearing the name Villisca and shivering without knowing why. The official investigation ended long ago, but the questions never did. Who killed the Moore family? Why? And how could such darkness find its way into such an ordinary place? The Villisca Axe Murders became more than a crime. They became a legend. The house where it happened still stands, restored to the way it was that summer night in 1912. Some say if you listen closely inside its walls, you can still hear the echo of footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, the hush of breath before the first blow fell. But the real haunting is not the ghost stories. It's the silence of justice undone. The faces of 8 innocent souls, Josiah and Sarah Moore, their 4 children, and Lena and Ina Stillinger, remain frozen in time, waiting for an answer that history never found. And perhaps that's the cruelest truth of all. The killer who brought terror to Villisca walked away into the dawn, faceless, nameless, and free. More than a century has passed since that night in 1912, yet the Villisca Axe Murders still feel disturbingly close, as though time has thinned but never severed the thread between then and now. The house still stands at 508 East 2nd Street, preserved with unnerving precision. The same wallpaper, the same iron bed frames, the same piano in the parlor. But today, investigators, historians, and curious visitors arrive not with lanterns and gossip, but with forensic kits, high-definition cameras, and questions that science might finally answer. Modern investigators often call Villisca one of the most tragically mishandled crime scenes in American history. When the murders were discovered, police failed to secure the house. Curious neighbors and reporters wandered through freely, contaminating every inch. Fingerprints were smeared, footprints trampled, the murder weapon touched, moved, and even photographed by untrained hands. If that crime had occurred today, the story might have been very different. Forensic teams would seal the perimeter within minutes. DNA samples from the axe handle, blood droplets, and skin cells might reveal the killer's genetic profile. Fingerprints could be cross-checked instantly against global databases. Even trace evidence, fibers, soil particles, or a single hair could expose the murderer. Investigators now speculate that, with preserved evidence, the Villisca case could have been solved decades later. Modern genealogical DNA testing, the kind that has cracked cold cases from the same era, might have traced the killer's bloodline, perhaps to an unsuspecting descendant. But in 1912, none of that was possible. The science didn't exist, and the system wasn't ready for the brutality that had come to Villisca. In recent decades, criminologists have re-examined the Villisca murders through the lens of modern profiling. The sheer ferocity of the killings, the overkill, the covering of the victims' faces, the methodical extinguishing of lamps, suggests a disturbed but deliberate mind. One interesting detail. When investigators found that mirrors and windows had been covered inside the Moore home, it was deeply unsettling. Covering mirrors after a death is a very old custom, rooted in folk beliefs about the soul, death, and the spirit world. It appears in many cultures, Jewish, Slavic, Victorian, and others, though with slightly different meanings. That detail seemed ritualistic, as though the killer was following some superstition or symbolic act, not just murdering. Two leading interpretations emerged. It might have been out of guilt or remorse. The killer couldn't bear to see his reflection. Or, more chillingly, it could have been a ritualistic gesture, consistent with a person who viewed death through a spiritual or obsessive lens. Possibly someone mentally unstable, religiously delusional, or performing what they believed was a cleansing act. In any case, there were not enough resources to investigate it properly at the time. Some experts believe the murderer may have been a serial offender, responsible for other axe murders across the Midwest between 1911 and 1914. These crimes, in Kansas, Illinois, and Colorado, shared haunting similarities. Entire families murdered in their sleep, blinds drawn, mirrors covered, an axe left behind. If the same hand wielded the weapon, then Villisca was not an isolated act of evil, but part of a pattern. A traveling killer moving from town to town by train, striking and disappearing into the night. Modern analysts, using behavioral profiling and geographic mapping, might have identified the killer's likely origin point, predicted his next move, even matched his handwriting or mental profile to known suspects like Paul Mueller or William Mansfield. But back then, the notion of a serial killer didn't even exist. Investigators treated each case as an isolated tragedy, never realizing they might all be chapters of one long, murderous story. In the years following the murders, Villisca never really recovered. The town split into factions, some convinced the killer was one of their own, others sure it was an outsider. Decades later, people still lower their voices when they say the name Moore. Today, the town wears its scars more openly. The Villisca Axe Murder House is now a museum, visited by thousands each year. Tourists walk through the dim rooms with flashlights, their footsteps creaking on the same wooden floors where the Moores once lived. Paranormal investigators come too, chasing whispers in the dark, recording the faint knocks and murmurs that some swear belong to the spirits of that June night. To locals, the house is both a burden and a legacy. Some believe its preservation keeps the memory alive, a warning against forgetting. Others see it as exploitation, a spectacle built on grief. Yet even those who criticize it still glance toward the house when they pass by, still quicken their steps as dusk falls. Modern Villisca is quiet now, a town of fewer than 2,000 souls. Yet beneath its calm surface lies an awareness that for all our science and progress, some mysteries refuse to yield. The faces of the victims stare from century-old photographs, frozen in the innocence of another time. The killer's face remains invisible, hidden somewhere in the folds of history. And though modern forensics might have solved the case, that certainty is lost forever. What remains is a story, part true crime, part ghost tale, that endures because it reminds us how fragile truth can be when mishandled, and how one night of violence can echo across generations. In the end, the Villisca Axe Murders are not just about who swung the axe, but about what was left behind. A silence so deep that even after 100 years, the world still leans close, listening.